you ever ask yourself, what exactly does the one drop rule look like?
If you didn't look like the audience, um, how quickly how quickly would you be fundraised into freedom? The true complexity of these racial dynamics is captured not in just descriptions, but in these powerful photographs. I think they're powerful even if we don't agree with the way they're being used, because, for example, a portrait of a girl named Rosa Downs. Her image, she's surrounded by this like ethereal vignette. It's just, again, very Victorian, very standard for the time. And it insinuates that she belongs to the Victorian middle to upper class. You're seeing her in this picture. Photographs are not cheap. You know, people don't just get their picture taken every day like we do now. The caption is shocking. And it says, Rosa, her name in like script, a slave girl from New Orleans. So now the viewer's perception is flipped. Rosa's not who they thought she was. And they're thinking, how can this be? What does this mean? They were the fair-faced stars of this abolitionist campaign. Hi, I'm Danielle Romero, and I'm so glad you're here with me today on my channel, where I started digging into my family's hidden history. My mom's grandmother was from Louisiana, and she moved to New York in the 1930s, left her whole identity behind. And so it's kind of started me on this journey of trying to understand American identity, which it's, if you can understand it, let me know. But it's kind of taken me down these paths of hidden history and the way America has interacted with race and identity. Today's topic is especially poignant for me based on that. And so we're going to talk about white slaves. And I'm going to say slaves. I know that we have changed the way we've, the language that we've used for the better, I think, saying enslaved people. But when I'm quoting directly from primary sources, I want to use the exact words that they used at the time. So just a heads up about that. And so let's dive in, because this is a really interesting topic. I've heard it referred to as propaganda. And I think we are inclined to say all propaganda is bad, right? But really, propaganda is a way of manipulating people, manipulating our emotions and our response to things. And I'm wondering, is that always a bad thing? So let's dive in and jump to 1855. So a senator from Massachusetts, his name was Charles Sumner. He sends a letter back home. He's been on this trip, and he wrote to his supporters about this 7-year-old girl. She had just been freed from slavery, and he thought her story was incredible. Now, Senator Sumner was known as an incredible orator. He could talk very well to audiences, and he says in this letter, though, that he thinks her showing up will blow out any speech of his out of the water. He was an abolitionist, and he's like, we got to get this girl's story in front of people. So he includes this daguerreotype of her. Her name is Mary. And it captured the girl. She's standing next to a small table. She's got like a little cute plaid jumper on, and she's just kind of like standing there. She looks like she's from a pretty wealthy family in this picture. Well, the Boston Telegraph published Sumner's full letter, and it stirred public attention, to say the least. Newspapers as far as Maine and Washington, D.C., reported on this girl. She was actually, quote, a white slave girl from Virginia. And this image of Mary had been circulating with paper copies of her daguerreotype sold alongside the narrative. Through Sumner's introduction and the ensuing media attention, this became more than just a recovered individual from the horrors of slavery. And you have to remember, at the time, 1855, like, the country is unknowingly heading towards the American Civil War. Mary becomes this talking point, a human interest story that's supposed to challenge people's perceptions about slavery. So she becomes this symbol for the abolitionist movement, embodying this complex issue of race and identity and freedom and all the things our country was grappling with at the time. And I think we're still grappling with that. So these visual tales of these biracial or white slaves, this starts being more frequent. It's being more frequently used by abolitionists. And these weren't just images, like I said, these were emotive tools. They were contrived in a lot of ways. Now, the stories were true. And these images, though, they fueled the abolitionist cause. They raised a lot of money and funds to emancipate enslaved people. We would have these photographs and these woodcuts of children, and a lot of them had very strikingly European features. I'll put some of these pictures up here. There'll be a juxtaposition with the other enslaved people that maybe they were from the same place, maybe they were getting just pulled in for this picture, who were a lot darker. And so there's this juxtaposition, but they're all bound by this one drop rule. And they were all relegated to the status of black, the other ancestry notwithstanding, right? So this was this was supposed to be like an unsettling reminder to the audience. There was a quote, there's a couple quotes I want to share with you. One was that people in the North were disposed to be incredulous when they hear of white slaves at the South, and yet a little reflection would convince them not only that there must be such slaves in the present system, but in the process of time, a large proportion of the slaves must be as white as their masters. And that was from B. William J. He had miscellaneous writings on slavery in 1853. Why is this working? Why is this working? I want to get to some more of the children's stories because there are a lot of these pictures and I want to tell you these stories. I think one is a sentimentalization of white childhood at the time. We're talking, this is the Victorian era, so to speak. Very staged pictures of children, especially little girls. They'd be in their dresses, their stockings with like a toy or sitting on a couch. And these are very common pictures that people would have. The dissonance of seeing the picture and then reading underneath that this child is enslaved was so shocking to people, especially in the North, who were not familiar with the one drop rule. We're not familiar with the way that the class and race issues would intersect in the South. And so you have that. So you're using what my husband would call, this is marketing 101. You are trying to make an issue relevant to the viewer. What will connect to them? Well, these pictures connected to people from the North. The complexities of racial identity. So there's this depiction of white looking, white passing, however you want to say it, enslaved children. It's challenging these perceptions of race, of class in the North, highlighting the arbitrary nature of racial classification, right? So this phenomenon of white passing, the societal implications of assimilation, like suddenly, I think people's eyes are opened a little bit that it's not just a white and black issue, right? Things aren't as clear cut as we like to make them out to be. Now, amidst these stories, one group's journey, though, stands emblematic of the paradoxical nature of racial identity within the slave narrative. In 1863, a cadre of freed people from Louisiana, so where my family was from, and they embarked on a tour to raise funds for freedmen's schools. So among them were children of complexions so light, so European that they were described as, quote, perfectly white or very fair or of unmixed race, even though these children had been enslaved and according to the one drop rule would be considered black. The true complexity of these racial dynamics is captured not in just descriptions, but in these powerful photographs. I think they're powerful even if we don't agree with the way they're being used because, for example, a portrait of a girl named Rosa Downs. Her image, she's surrounded by this like ethereal vignette. It's just, again, very Victorian, very standard for the time. And it insinuates that she belongs to the Victorian middle to upper class. You're seeing her in this picture. Photographs are not cheap. You know, people don't just get their picture taken every day like we do now. But below, you know, this little girl in this picture, the caption is shocking. And it says, Rosa, her name in like script, a slave girl from New Orleans. So now the viewer's perception is flipped. Rosa's not who they thought she was. And they're thinking, how can this be? What does this mean? So Rosa, along with other children that I want to introduce you to, Rebecca and Charles, they were the fair-faced stars of this abolitionist campaign, challenging their perceptions of race and identity and of slavery. Now, I think it's important to point out, so these pictures would be sold to raise money, but the lighter skinned children, their portraits were sold at a much higher rate than the darker skinned children, like who also had portraits. A lot of historians believe that this really played on the Victorian sentiment and fears that slavery could come for anybody. If this child who looks like this could be enslaved, could my children be enslaved? And that's exactly the direction that some abolitionists went. So you may know Harriet Beecher Stowe. Her father was a pastor, and he played on these same things. At one point, Mr. Beecher carried up into the pulpit a little girl, had large eyes, light hair, and as fair as a lily. So they're already setting the stage to say, like, the little girl he picked, Fanny Virginia Cassiopeia Lawrence, was so shockingly not black looking to the Northern audience. And so he brings her up. Source says, pausing a moment to conquer his emotion, he sent a shiver of horror through the congregation, saying, quote, "This child was born a slave and is just redeemed from slavery." It is impossible to describe the effect of this announcement. The fact seems so incredible and so atrocious that at first, spectators held their breath in amazement and then were melted to tears. I'm sorry. So it's what's hard for me about this, and I'm sure that is hard for you about this, is that abolitionists had to capitalize on this unsettling notion that Fanny's white-like features or her white features or her European features or whatever, they were needed to evoke that sense of fear in the white audience and the concern that the chains of slavery could easily ensnare their own family. And Reverend Beecher said, quote, "While your children are brought up to fear and serve the Lord, this little one, just as beautiful, would be made through slavery a child of damnation." And Beecher's presentation drew a direct parallel between this enslaved girl and the children of his congregation, urging empathy and action. And he said, quote, "Mothers, how would you feel if your little daughters were to be sold away from you? I know you will not let this child go back to slavery." And his successful fundraising was able to secure her freedom, culminating in this declaration that the child is free. And it was met with applause, and there's this tangible outcome of channeling sentiment into action. But the issue here is just that, like, if you didn't look the right way, if you didn't look like the audience, how quickly would you be fundraised into freedom? These are questions that I have while I'm reading this. Was this the right thing to do? Now, for Northern readers from Harper's Weekly magazine, their emotional response to a story of 3 white enslaved children was significantly heightened due to the family stories. There's this Harper's Weekly article I want to touch on, and it talks about these 3 children. Actually, I think there's like 5 children. I want to go through them a little bit. So the way that these children were described was that they are, with the exception of the child named Augusta, who was slightly darker than the other 3 children, they were to all appearance of unmixed white race. And the 4 all but white slave children were delineated as follows. Rebecca is 11 years old and was a slave in her father's house, the special attendant of a girl a little older than herself. To all appearance, she is perfectly white. Her complexion, her hair, her features show not the slightest trace of Negro blood. In the few months during which she has been at school, she has learned to read well and writes neatly as most children her age. Her mother and grandmother live in New Orleans, where they support themselves comfortably by their own labor. The grandmother, an intelligent mulatto, told Mr. Bacon that she had raised a large family of children, but these are all that are left for her. Rosina Downs is not quite 7 years old. She's a fair child with blonde complexion and silky hair. Her father is in the rebel army. She has one sister as white as herself and the 3 brothers who are darker. Her mother, a bright mulatto, lives in New Orleans in a poor hut and has had hard work to support her family. Charles Taylor is 8 years old. His complexion is very fair, his hair light and silky. 3 out of 5 boys in any school in New York are darker than he. And Augusta is 9 years old. Her mother, who is almost white, was owned by her half-brother named Solomon, who still retains 2 of her children. Yet this white boy with his mother, as he declares, has been sold twice as a slave. First by his father and his owner, they had it in quotes, Alexander of Lewis County, Virginia, to a slave trader named Harrison, who sold him to another man in New Orleans. This little girl has no one to see her. She'll be glad to live with you, and she is white and more like you white folks. And I think this selective sharing of the personal histories really underscores the uncomfortable truth that you obviously have come to at this point with me, that the experiences of these Black children did not resonate with white Northern readership the same way. Even for people who were already abolitionists, already for people who were against slavery, it just didn't strike the same chord. And so the use of white-looking enslaved children as a tool for anti-slavery marketing, so to speak. Now, I think another part of this is that the potency of these images to the Northern readers and consumers of this information is this idea that looking white doesn't keep you out of slavery. And so I think there's this complexity of like, well, they're thinking, well, all enslaved people look like this. And this is showing, well, that's not always the case. And it was jarring for a lot of people, and it was scary for a lot of them. Is this good marketing? Yes, it's great marketing. By adapting the familiar visual language of middle class domestic bliss with these pictures and these girls who appear white, the creators of these photographs were making bold political statements. They were bringing the reality of slavery into direct contact with the sentimentality of the white northern families. And it bridged the gap between these atrocities that were distant and seemed like they were happening to the other kinds of people, not us, and personal experience and saying, wait, that little girl looks like my daughter. I think the use though of these white appearing children, these white children, however you want to say it, enslaved children in the abolitionist movement, I think it's a complex ethical debate though. So we're going to say, is it good marketing? Yes. Does that mean it should be done? I don't know. Because on one hand, these images are potentially waking up more empathy to the cause for the abolitionist movement. And it's difficult when you just hear statistics. It's hard to feel a lot of empathy for numbers and statistics, but when you see people and you hear their backstory, you feel differently. We connect with each other. But the strategy, I think, is also very uncomfortable. I think it implied this hierarchy. It demonstrates this hierarchy of worthiness based on how white the children looked. And I think you can look at it a couple ways. One way you could say, well, this is demonstrating this hierarchy of worthiness based on, well, how white do you look? Like, people care more based on how white you are. And I think that is true to an extent. But I think the other side is that it's not just about how white you are, but I think it's about how much someone looks like you. And so they're talking about a white audience. And so they're showing white children. So I think there's this tension of like, if these people were already abolitionists, they already believed slavery was wrong. And maybe this prompted them to donate more money or do something extra. But at the same time, the idea that these white children could be enslaved also posed a problem for them. And it was this idea that that these hierarchies that they thought did exist, that there were these protections that were in place, they weren't really there. It could change depending on this factor or this factor. And I think it suggests that the visible markers upon which racial and class distinctions were made were actually unreliable. And I think that is unsettling for a lot of people. I think this is a difficult topic. I think I mentioned this before, but I majored in history, obviously, in my undergrad. But I focused a lot on Soviet history. I was very interested in the propaganda. And I took some classes on Soviet propaganda, trying to understand why did it do what it did so well? And sometimes propaganda is used in a good way. If you look at, during World War II, there's a lot of propaganda posters put out and things trying to encourage Americans to like grow more food, to kind of like, like just do things that will help the troops abroad. And propaganda, successful propaganda, does a couple things. One of the things it does, though, is you have an immediate emotional reaction to it of pride in your country or fear for yourself and your family. And a lot of times the propaganda gives you a choice of like, do this, otherwise this will happen. Or if you don't do this, this is going to happen. And I think that these images worked a lot in the same way. This fear of if that white girl could be enslaved, my child could be enslaved. And so it really shook up the way that people were looking at this.
You ever ask yourself, what exactly does the one drop rule look like?